Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be taking a look at the Kramatorsk radiation accident, nuclear apartment, by a channel called Kyle Hill. I've never seen this channel, so I have no idea what to expect, but as always I will have a link to the original content down in the description below. In case you like what you see here, I highly encourage you to head over there and show the channel some support as well. Anyway, this week, we are doing a nuclear or an atomic age and nuclear accident themed week alongside Kings and Generals Great Northern War series. That's a long series, very, very long, so I thought I'd throw in a separate theme leading up to the series that's going to follow the Great Northern War, which will be Oversimplified, the Cold War. Now I want to get us in the mood for that. So, the Kramatorsk radiation accident, if you haven't heard of this, again, it's something that happened in Ukraine over the course of the 1980s. And we'll just let the video get into it. I will add what I can as we go along.
Between 1980 and 1989, 4 people between 2 young families would die, suddenly, of leukemia. The connection? They all lived in the same apartment inside a hastily built building in modern-day Ukraine.
All right, so let's touch on a couple of things there right off the bat. So first of all, 4 people die. All 3 of them are young people, teenagers or children. One of them is an adult, the mother of 2 of the kids, I believe, if I remember correctly. Kramatorsk, Ukraine is in eastern Ukraine. It is an area that is being severely affected by the current ongoing war. It's been highly evacuated. There's been a lot of missile attacks on this city. So that's the context. The modern context of this city. In the 1980s, this is still Soviet period, and we're looking at, this is a Brezhnevka apartment. If you're not familiar with Soviet architecture, let me just put it this way. When I first time I ever traveled to Russia, 2 things struck me immediately as our plane was coming down in, preparing for a landing at Sheremetyevo in Moscow. The first was, as we approached the city itself, just how empty it was around the city and how flat. So it was just empty forested land. I'm from Colorado. I am literally completely surrounded by mountains where I live. I'm in a valley. So flat is not something I do. It's not part of my normal everyday experience. I've traveled a lot. I've seen a lot of flat. But other than the Great Plains here in the States, I've never seen anything quite like that part of Eastern Europe, going down over it. Just so many vast, empty stretches, pocketed by these tiny little villages and then these very isolated, huge cities like Moscow. The second thing that jumped out at me, though, was the Soviet-era apartment architecture. It's just so uniform, so distinctive. I knew about it going in there, but it was just kind of a vague understanding from mostly propaganda. Seeing it firsthand and seeing just how ubiquitous it is, how it's everywhere, was kind of eye-opening. Because just what I saw, what jumped out at me the most was these tall, kind of off-whitish, 5-story roughly buildings that were very blockish, very plain-looking. Those were Khrushchyovka. So each Soviet leader, department built under their regime, tended to take their name. So the styles. So you would have your Stalinska, which would be the apartment built under Stalin. They tended to be brick. They tended to be ornate, at least early on. Later, they got more plain as there was more and more of a rush to get a lot of the apartments built, so that they have housing for everybody. Khrushchevka, the ones I think most of us think of, those are the big blocky white ones that are very plain, very unadorned. They tend to be about 5 stories tall, most of them, during the Khrushchev era. And then you get into the Brezhnev era, which this is. This is a Brezhnevka. They tend to be a little taller than the Khrushchev. They can vary, all of them can vary, but they tend to be taller. They tend to go up closer to 8 stories. I think this one looks like it's about that height. They tend to have a lot more windows and glass, and again, you can see that here. And I think it's the Brezhnevka that are the first ones to start using more modern technology like elevators. Others probably had them, but these are the ones where they start becoming a little more common. These are going to be your upscale apartments compared to what came before, with modern amenities. Modern by the Soviet standards, probably not by the rest of Western standards. They were definitely lagging behind at this period, but the 80s is going to see a bit of a change in that, because this period in the 80s, they're trying to catch back up again, plus they're trying to host the Winter Olympics. So, or the Summer Olympics, I believe it was, was it 80, 81? I don't remember exactly. And they did a lot of modernization in preparation for that so they could put on a big show for the world. So that's kind of where this apartment gets built during that period.
Within the walls of that apartment, one of history's deadliest orphan sources.
Okay, orphan-source, if you're not familiar with, refers to a lost source of radioactive material. And it can be pretty much anything from a tiny container all the way up to an actual nuclear weapon. It's a lost source of nuclear radiation.
This is the true story of the radiological accident in Kramatorsk.
Accident occurred here at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant.
Yep.
Before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, its economy did. After a few decades of rapid economic growth, the communist conglomerate swiftly stagnated in the 1970s and 80s. By that point, it had borrowed all the modernizing economic models from the West that it could. It was prioritizing heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods. By 1980, the standard of living in the Soviet Union was declining. At the same time, the Soviets were making a mad dash to put on a more prosperous face for the 1980 Summer Olympics, which Moscow was hosting. The Games were to be a statement to the West that communism works, and so party leaders went back to what got them a 5% growth rate after World War II: rapid expansion.
Yep.
This was the backdrop for a stone quarry in the Donetsk region of modern-day Ukraine. Workers there were tasked with providing a huge amount of basic building resources, and quickly. The West was not to see that the standard of living
I'm sorry, I just wanted to see what this had to say. Okay.
for the average man in the Soviet Union was just a third of what it was in America. Free.
They're comparing, the first one is comparing us, and the second one is them. It's a comparison.
Apartments with hot water and an elevator? Isn't communism grand? As the Olympics got closer, whole towns sprung up from nothing.
Yeah.
The materials for those towns came from quarries like these.
Don't underestimate the power of the Olympics. I remember when they were bringing the Winter Olympics over to Salt Lake City, which is not that terribly far from where I
And
live.
from tired
Whoops, sorry. I remember when they were preparing Salt Lake City. I used to visit Salt Lake City twice a year. My father worked for the railroad. One of the benefits that he had was that family members could ride the passenger line a couple times every year for free between Denver and Salt Lake City. And occasionally I'd go to Denver, but more often than not that I went to Salt Lake City for shopping primarily. Not because I don't like Denver. When I went to Denver, though, I usually went for the scenery because I just loved the ride up and over the Rockies. Gorgeous, gorgeous. If I went that way, that's what I went for. If I wanted to do something practical, I went to Salt Lake. Not necessarily because it has more or anything like that, but it's a much more easy city to navigate, especially if you're not on your own and you're going to be doing it without your own vehicle. It's just much better layout, much better organized. So I went to Salt Lake City all the time. And I remember in the build up to the Winter Olympics, how much construction they were doing. They were completely redoing all their highways and byways and interstate ramps and roads. It was just pure chaos during that period. Because they wanted to get ready. They wanted to put on the best face possible. They were getting all this incoming money and they wanted to be ready for it with renovations, with beautification, with increasing traffic flow capacity. And the same thing's happening over here in 1980 in the Soviet Union. They're going to have a lot of people from all over the world coming in. They want people to be jealous of this communist utopia. So they've got to get everything ready. They got to make the entire region presentable. They got to put a good face on the Soviet Union. So they're investing a lot in a facelift, basically.
The materials for those towns came from quarries like these, and from tired workers under incredible pressure. Workers liable to make a mistake. Cesium-137 is an intensely radioactive isotope.
Yes.
It's infamous for being the chief contaminant in the Chernobyl and Fukushima exclusion zones, but it has many far less problematic applications.
Let's talk about cesium. There's about 40 isotopes of cesium. 137 is one of the most radioactive. It emits a couple of different waves. I think it's beta and gamma. I'm pretty sure it's beta and gamma, with gamma being the really dangerous one because gamma is better at penetrating other materials than alpha or beta waves. So cesium is deadly. It is a byproduct of nuclear fission, so you'll find it in a lot of these reactors as a result. That's why when you have things like Chernobyl, that's why this is so prevalent. This is one of the byproducts of nuclear fission.
In small amounts, cesium-137 can power atomic clocks, calibrate Geiger counters, sterilize food and medical equipment, and treat cancer. In a certain quarry in the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, a capsule of cesium was being used in a gauge that judges the thickness of compacted materials like soil and asphalt. A nuclear gauge is then sort of like an X-ray machine.
It's what's called a densometer. Well, there's a densimeter and there's a densitometer, I believe is what it's called. This is 30 years in my past, but I'm familiar with these things. They're used to measure the density of the ground. And it looks like he's getting ready to explain it, so I'm not going to. But yeah, these tools are used for measuring ground density, and they do it by using radioactivity.
But instead of getting an image back, you get a depth or thickness, which the device calculates by measuring the amount of radiation it receives from its source, which is inside a shielded rod and lowered into the material in question. That source is usually locked inside the gauge when not in use. The Olympics was close. The Soviet Union had a statement to make. Any work stoppage in the quarries meant that a party ticket had to be made, and someone would have to answer for it. This pressure cooker is how, sometime in the late 70s, a capsule of cesium-137 fell out of a radiation gauge.
Oops.
The news made its way up the chain, reportedly all the way to Leonid Brezhnev himself, General Secretary of the Communist Party. He forbid any
Look at those
pause in
eyebrows.
construction.
Wow.
The Olympics was going to happen, orphan-source or not. A week later, the search for the capsule was ordered stopped. But it wasn't actually lost. It was right under their noses, buried in a tremendous pile of gravel, a nuclear needle in a haystack. This haystack would soon become this specific apartment building in eastern Ukraine.
Let's talk about that because something kind of similar happened here where I live. We did not have an orphan object, but I live in western Colorado. Western Colorado, eastern Utah were the center of what was called the U-boom back in the 50s and 60s. That was a period when there was this mad rush for uranium, and there are uranium fields all over the place out here. I'm surrounded by uranium mines. When I was a kid, we were out hiking, and I was annoying my mother, so she told me to go find something interesting. I went out and found a old chewing tobacco tin that had a deed to a uranium mine in it. They're all over the place. But you're mining all this uranium around where I live. This is the site for the uranium that was used in the Manhattan Project. The Department of Energy here in the town where I live, which is within walking distance of my house, I could walk there probably in an hour, give or take. Well, when I was younger, I could have, probably less than that. And nowadays, I'll be lucky if I make it and don't fall over on my face halfway there. Getting old is fun. Anyway, where am I going with this? The Department of Energy is where that uranium was processed for the Manhattan Project. There's a couple of towns not far from here. A town called Uravan is no longer there. They recently took away the last of the main buildings that used to be there. Uravan is named for uranium and vanadium, the two minerals that they were mining in that region. So this is uranium central. This is U-boom territory. And what I'm trying to get at here is after all this mining was done, and all the processing is done, you have mill tailings, the leftovers, from all this mining and all of this processing. And for some reason, people thought it would be a good idea to use these mill tailings for construction, for foundation fill, for road fill, for concrete. And of course, all this of these uranium mill tailings are radioactive. And especially when I was younger, in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, there was this big movement to clean up the cities around here because we had a lot of radioactive roads, radioactive sidewalks, radioactive buildings. They did surveys. If you were to go online and look at real estate for sale in western Colorado, especially areas like Grand Junction, Delta, Montrose, Fruita, Clifton, you will find a lot of them will refer to mill tailings results on their fact sheet for the real estate site. That's because that is attached to your property, whether you've had mill tailings detected there and whether they've been removed. That's something that people want to know. Are you buying a radioactive building? Now, how radioactive is it? Not very. I did before this one, I did a thing on Project Rulison. This is along the same lines. It's not so much about how dangerous it is as it is public perception. Nobody wants to buy a place that they know is radioactive, even if it's just, this much above background radiation. Was it hazardous? To some degree. There have been lung problems associated with uranium mill tailings. I don't remember the counts at all because this is an ongoing. Anything I can remember is probably way outdated by now, but the biggest issue had been dust getting into lungs, irradiated dust. So when not necessarily the buildings themselves, but if you're tearing things down or digging stuff up and the dust gets in your lungs, that's where you end up with incidents. Anyway, I'm getting off topic here, but what happened here is similar to what happened over here in Kramatorsk. What we had was just radioactive waste, so to speak. What they have is a lost, highly irradiated item in a stone quarry that's going to be used for construction purposes.
The residents of the newly built Building 7 in modern-day Kramatorsk, Ukraine, were thrilled. The Communist Party had made good on their Olympic plans and delivered something significantly nicer to the region. It was now the early 80s. Over the next 9 years, 2 families would live in Unit 85 of Building 7. Both of them had children. Both of them would place the children's bed against the same wall, in the same room, the wall where a capsule of cesium was waiting silently, encased in concrete. The first family moved into Building 7 in 1981, a mother, her 18-year-old daughter, and her 16-year-old son. The daughter didn't make it a year. The son didn't make it a year after that. The mother died around the same time. They all died of leukemia, a kind of blood cancer. Rumors in the building started. Gossip, superstition. Was this a tragic coincidence? Was the building cursed? Their doctors attributed the family's fate to poor genetics.
So yeah, and if you know anything about the Soviet Union during this period, that shouldn't shock you. Most everybody by now is probably familiar with Chernobyl. Either they lived through it like I did and paid attention to the news then, or the very popular HBO series Chernobyl had introduced the concept to an entirely new generation. And government is very fast to try to cover this kind of stuff up. And doctors and everybody like that are very reluctant to suggest anything along those lines. Now, this early stage, I don't think it's a cover-up, but there's going to be that element to this. Fear of looking too closely for answers. They blamed everything on genetics. Leukemia can be passed genetically, but it's very rare for that to happen. Leukemia is one of those, it's a early stage sign of radiation problems. Typically, if you get high radiation exposure, leukemia is going to be one of the first common signs that you're going to see.
Even as the family's neighbors were starting to experience symptoms.
Yep.
The doctor's misdiagnosis, however, wasn't entirely unsurprising, as few could have imagined that what wiped out the entire family was less than a paperclip's mass of cesium.
Yeah, and if it's genetic, why would they all die one right after the other? That's the other question you got to ask. Why would the mother live so much longer than her daughter and son, but die within, year or two of each other? That's kind of suspicious.
Misplaced years ago in a rush to show the West that the Soviet Union knew what it was doing. Why leukemia? Why does radiation cause cancer at all? The pathway is pretty simple. Certain kinds of radiation are ionizing. They have the energy to break chemical bonds and remove electrons from atoms, changing how those atoms interact with each other. Every cell in your body has an immensely complicated double helix of billions of molecules, which are made of ionizable atoms. And changes to this helical information can cause a human cell to die or mutate. So, radiation can cause cancer because if it's ionizing, it can damage DNA and cause the mutations that lead to the disease. But why a blood disease like leukemia specifically? Because radiation is most harmful to cells in the human body that divide more often.
Yeah, so it's going to be things like your bone marrow, your blood cells, your hair, because these things divide quickly because they grow fast, they replenish quickly.
As DNA is more vulnerable when a cell is in the process of splitting. The double helix is unzipped into more fragile single strands, and there is less time for any repair mechanisms to kick into action. Significant DNA damage can also alter the splitting process itself in a so-called mitotic catastrophe. Leukemia is particularly associated with accidental doses of radiation because it does a disproportionate amount of damage to the ever-dividing red and white blood cells in your bone marrow. Treating cancer also involves large doses of radiation, beam, isotope, or otherwise, and so it hits dividing cells as a side effect. Most of us unfortunately know or have known someone with cancer, and we know the associated medical struggle: anemia, nausea, loss of hair.
Yep.
Why those specific symptoms? Again, these are the places in the body with the fastest cell turnover: bone marrow, stomach lining, hair follicles. With no diagnosis for the family, and now no tenants for Unit 85, the Kramatorsk Executive Committee gave the keys to the apartment to a new family for a new tragedy. Sometime before 1987, two boys were living with their father and mother in Unit 85. Their bed was pushed up against the wall. A carpet now hung from that wall as decoration. There was a spot burnt into it. No one seemed to notice. Both
That's
sons
a bad
would be admitted
sign.
to the hospital for leukemia in 1987, and one of them would die. Why were all these young people dying from cancer, and a specific cancer at that? Again, nothing from doctors aside from a diagnosis. The father of the boys, understandably distraught, fought for some kind of investigation, anything. It would be 2 years before any expert took his grief seriously. Because industrial radiation gauges need to see through dense material like soil and metal, their sources, like cobalt, iridium, and cesium, are intensely radioactive. When misplaced, as they have been many times in the nuclear industry's history.
That's very recent. This is one that happened in Australia. I want to say, was it 2019, I think? Wasn't that long ago. They lost something similar, about the same size. I believe in that case, they were transporting equipment that used one of these little radioactive, call them batteries for lack of a better term. They had it when they left the site they were using it. When they got back to their destination, they didn't have it. So it apparently had gotten loose somewhere along en route. So they had to go back and try to track it down. And in the case of Australia, they actually ended up finding it. But they put a lot of effort and time into locating this because they were afraid that that little capsule could get stuck in something like, because it was probably lost on the highway. It could get stuck in a car wheel or something like that. And instead of a cursed apartment, you might have a cursed car where people who are in proximity to that car long enough will get sick. So, but even then, it's just, they gotta find it. Australia, I think they used a special vehicle that had radioactive detection devices on it, and they found it that way. But they put a lot more effort into it than the Soviets did back in the late 70s. These things are important to find if they get lost.
Even very recently, they can cause severe tissue damage, even death, in Douglas Crofut's case, though that may have been history's only recorded radioactive suicide. And so, Even encased in the concrete wall of Unit 85, a capsule of cesium-137 is a drop-and-run kind of situation. The isotope both emits beta and gamma radiation. The beta radiation, electrons, are stopped easily. The gamma rays, high-energy photons, are not. They can penetrate into meters of concrete. Hastily built apartment buildings in the Soviet Union are not meters thick. The beds of the 4 children who passed were placed in a room emitting an estimated 1,800 Roentgens of radiation per year. Converting this to another unit for comparison, that's over 2,000 microsieverts per hour.
Jeez.
Using 3 different Geiger counters, I measured the ambient radiation in the room where I myself sleep. It's around 0.05 to 0.1 microsieverts per hour. The unfortunate families were sleeping in an apartment with a rate 41,000 times higher than this. This is a rate comparable to getting a chest x-ray every 3 minutes for a year. It's comparable to sleeping in the hospital basement in Pripyat, where Chernobyl's firefighters ditched their heavily contaminated equipment.
Yeah, so I think he's putting it in perspective really well there. And this is another case. They originally sent some people in to try to scan this apartment, but the readings were so strong that the initial equipment used couldn't track it because it was completely off the scale. They had to send out for very specialized equipment used for high radiation areas like nuclear power plants in order to actually get a measurement. That's how high it was.
And sleeping there, night after night, night after night. For at least 9 years in Kramatorsk, Ukraine, 2 families lived in an apartment with rates 100 times higher than what would eventually become the tomb of Chernobyl reactor number 4.
Crazy.
The second family's grieving father would have to wait 2 years after holding a funeral.
Chernobyl, the victims of Chernobyl.
For his son in his own apartment before radiologists finally entered Unit 85. They were shocked. Reportedly, even before opening the front door, they realized that they would need better equipment.
Yeah,
They returned
exactly.
with radiation meters from the headquarters of Civil Defense. The rate was highest in the bedroom where all the children had slept, and higher still at the wall the bed was pushed up against.
Jeez.
It was immediately clear that this was a cut-and-run situation. Cut out the part of the wall with the highest reading and get it out of the apartment as fast as possible. According to radiologist and physician Nikolai Savchenko, who was present during that inspection, quote, "In order to cut out part of the wall, lead plates were nailed to its area to protect workers. The driver of a sand truck was also shielded with lead plates and an apron.
That'd be a
And the
lead
truck
line
took the
apron.
dangerous cargo to the factory laboratory, from where it was taken by specialists from the Kyiv Institute for Nuclear Research." End quote. Before the radiologists left Unit 85, they swabbed everything. But they found nothing. Clean. Everything was in a small section of wall on its way to Kyiv. Now in Ukraine's capital, the wall fragment was placed in a hot cell, a shielded box or room where scientists can remotely manipulate radioactive material. Upon the wall's dissection, researchers found a tiny 8 by 4 millimeter capsule. The serial number on it matched the one lost a decade ago in a quarry. The killer inside the walls of Building 7 was caught. Everyone could go back to living their lives. Or so the scientists thought. The tenants of Building 7 disagreed.
Yeah.
They demanded further examination of their apartments and, if needed, medical care. And so specialists, doctors, and the city executive committee met with the residents of Building 7 in the March of 1990. Again, according to radiologist Savchenko, who was present, quote, "The meeting was held in a tense atmosphere, and it was not possible to completely dispel the distrust of the residents."
Yeah, so this is similar to what I was saying in the previous video on the Rulison project. It doesn't matter whether it's safe or not, or safe-ish or not. The public perception is, once the cat's out of the bag and you know something's radioactive, public reaction is going to be mistrust. They're going to be angry, upset. That happened with Rulison. That happened with the uranium mill cuttings here. And clearly that's going to happen here. People were dying here. This is worse of the 3 that I've used as examples by far. I wouldn't want to live in that apartment. I don't care how much the government reassured me it was safe. After that many people died and, others got sick.
The meeting was very tragic. Angry cries, tears, All of this, understandable,
Yeah.
especially considering what had happened 1,000 kilometers away just 4 years before, Chernobyl. Across 9 years, a capsule of cesium-137 had killed 4 people.
Yeah, Chernobyl happened. I was just getting ready to graduate when Chernobyl happened. And that's something I followed very closely at that time because I had the time. I was getting out of school finally. And because it was such a eye-opener. It was such a tragedy. And yeah, Zhirtvi Chernobyl, that is the victims of Chernobyl. I'm not sure why he keeps putting it up, other than I think getting ready to talk about it.
And gave 17 of their neighbors an abnormally high dose of radiation. These 17 were eventually lumped into the same group of so-called victims of Chernobyl for medical assistance purposes.
Ah, okay, that's why.
This designation and assistance, however, was canceled 3 years later, in 1993. As to who any of these people were or are, that information appears lost to time. Because the radioactive contamination was completely contained in a capsule, Building 7 wasn't demolished. Only the wall of Unit 85 was removed. In fact, in 2003, reportedly, one of the families was still living in Unit 85. Quote, they still live in that same apartment. They couldn't leave their home, in which they experienced such tragic moments. Already a middle-aged couple who have a future, the future of their daughter, and who do not want to stir up the past. We lived with this ampule for 9 years, the mother says bitterly. The father is silent. He said everything he needed to 13 years ago. The grief that has befallen our family is immeasurable. As of 2021, Building 7 is still there. Maybe the family is too.
Gotta wonder if it still is now, unfortunately, because of the ongoing, like I said, Kramatorsk has been heavily affected by the ongoing war right now. Anyway, thank you for joining me. We'll be back again tomorrow for yet more Great Northern War and more content on the atomic era and or nuclear type accidents or anything that kind of intersects with those as our build up to the Cold War. Until next time, see you later. Bye-bye.